Chris Friesen, Immigrant Settlement Services of British Columbia. Welcome to the Islam Unravelled Anti-Racist podcast. Really a great fan of your work and the work, especially with refugees and newcomers. I'm sure has been an amazing journey. And how we'd like to start off, Chris, is we'd like to talk about the origin story, the kind of childhood kind of influences and role models that kind of brought you to this kind of awareness of this work and career path. So please talk about your background.
Sure. So as you know, my name is Chris Friesen, with ISS of BC as the Chief Operating Officer. I think it definitely began. There was a few instrumental milestones in my life that drew me in this direction. One, of course, was parents. My parents were actively involved in the social justice movement. They were involved in their faith, in the United Church, Vietnamese boat people, sponsorship, all of that early exposure to speaking out, attending protests, and so forth, shaped and influenced, who I am today. Um, while attending the University of British Columbia as an undergraduate student, I was involved with a number of other students in leading a referendum at UBC to increase the student fees by 50 cents in 1985 to establish a permanent student refugee scholarship program that would allow refugee students from around the world to gain access to Canada as permanent residents and attend the university on a scholarship at both the either undergraduate or graduate level. And and that evolved to a period of time overseas in East Africa, working with student refugees as part of a British educational charity or trust. So those were kind of periods of time in my life that helped to shape my continued passion and interest in this area.
And you mentioned Vietnam. The Vietnam War, starting in the late 60s and early 70s, created a refugee crisis. And maybe let's talk about that, because there's so much, so many movies about it, and again, something that echoed in the consciousness of North Americans for many decades. Let's talk about that and that influence of that time.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I should also say too that on my father's side, my ancestors came to Canada as refugees from Eastern Europe, arriving as settlers back in July 13th, 1875, in the
Wow.
Treaty 5 in southern Manitoba. So that was another part, that's probably generations that sort of influenced, overall direction. But going back to the Vietnam War, and what was happening there, um, greatly influenced my parents, as it did many Canadians, as to how Vietnamese were being treated, the war, the American involvement, bombing, and so forth. It became, very much the catalyst that defined and expanded the whole community sponsorship program model that remains a unique innovation, Canada-made innovation, the private refugee sponsorship program. Um, the fact that in a short period of time, over 60,000 Vietnamese boat people were resettled to Canada through the efforts of Canadians of different faith communities, local community leaders, etc. I often compare the 2015, 2016 Operation Syrian Refugee and the response by Canadians to this national project was, to today's generation what it was for myself and my parents of the Vietnamese boat people and their generation. The significant global crises that called on Canadians to act in creative ways, to engage in practical ways for the betterment of humanity.
Absolutely. And like you said, unique ways of sponsoring refugees through faith-based organizations, through private sponsorships with corporate sponsorships and government sponsorships. So in that work, in our previous conversation, you mentioned the refugees from Uganda, the Ismaili community, and many had come, and that much of it was the impetus behind the origin of ISS of BC.
Correct. Yeah, we, as a immigrant and refugee serving agency, our humble beginnings started in 1968 as a group of volunteers gathered to support newcomers of various faith and ethnic origins. But it was the crisis in Uganda and President Idi Amin's 90-day verdict that struck the need to, and Pierre Elliott Trudeau agreement to resettle 7,000 Asian Ugandan refugees fleeing Idi Amin, that necessitated the formal incorporation as a not-for-profit charity. That was the impetus for ISS of BC. And it was the fall of 1972, over a 90-day period, where ISS of BC welcomed and supported close to 1,200 Asian Ugandans fleeing Idi Amin during that fall of 1972. So next year marks our 50th year, as one of the first immigrant and refugee serving organizations in British Columbia. And through the 70s, we had programming in various communities throughout British Columbia. And these programs evolved into separate legal entity. So many immigrant and refugee serving agencies have their beginnings that emerged out of initial programs that ISS at BC ran back then.
And these programs and for those that came from Uganda, many became very, very successful business people, adding to the economy, providing jobs, and providing a lot of resources to benefit Canada. And as we know, there's a perception online or in certain circles that somehow immigrants and refugees are somehow taking away from society or taking away. But from your experience, let's talk about the net gain Canada gets from refugees that do get established, and in your experience with not only the folks from Uganda but others.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize, although we, as a society and as part of our immigration legislation, we categorize newcomers, whether they're economic class, family class, humanitarian class. But ultimately, this is about nation building. It's about social cohesion. It's about pluralism, and I think what is important to understand or remind ourselves is, regardless of what category a newcomer will enter this country, they are all coming with tremendous assets, resilience, life experience, and skills. And we have found that I have found this over the past over 30 years of my work in this sector, of the tremendous contributions, not only economically, but socially, to the arts, the culture, that the contributions of newcomers, have made to these lands and this country.
And what's amazing is, as you said, that all of us that are here in these lands, we are settlers,
Yeah.
and one of the tragic parts of our history is what happened with our First Nations forebears, that they were their language, they weren't allowed to speak their language, their culture. And ISS of BC, when people come, Arabic, Farsi, Spanish, to really look holistically at the person, they're not going to understand English, they're not going to understand our cultural ways and norms. And let's talk about how to take in account of that person's culture, religion, and language, how ISS of BC has pioneered ways to kind of integrate folks that speak, again, languages like Chinese and Korean, Mandarin and Korean. Please talk
I
about that.
think it really starts at, looking at the person or the family as an individual. One size doesn't fit all. The programs and needs vary greatly depending on those individuals or families' assets and skills. And it's about customizing the support necessary to help them navigate through the complexity of our systems. And so in one case, it may be, through adult English as an additional language classes to support that language acquisition process. It may be through our temporary housing facility for those that are coming from abroad as government assisted refugees after spending decades in protracted camp or refugee situations. It may be related to the children who, by nature, although the decision to immigrate or flee and seek opportunity of rebuilding their lives in this country, have their own migration experience. And what does that mean? And how can we best help them support their settlement process, work with them in the skills that they have to help them reach their full capacity. Because ultimately, we have found that everyone wants to contribute to this country. And in many cases, in those first years in Canada, folks are working multiple jobs in order to establish themselves, in order to support and give opportunities for their children. That is part of the process, the transition. But ultimately, in the research that we have done, it is very clear that ultimately they want to give back. This country has given them the opportunity to rebuild their lives, and they want to give back. They want to be active participants. They want to be active citizens. That's why, so many newcomers' ultimate goal is to establish citizenship, to obtain that Canadian passport, the right to vote, the right to seek office, is all part of this evolving story that is unique in the world, given the clashes and debates and rise of ultra-right movements in certain parts of the country. We don't have it perfect. There's a ways to go. There isn't an end point, but many of the processes and approaches that have been developed going back to the 70s have bode well and distinguished us from other countries in the world, other immigrant receiving or refugee receiving countries in the world.
And I will say, I visited the location, ISS of BC Welcome House, and what an amazing facility. And when I went, I didn't know the backstory that you and I had discussed, that in your work to prepare the schematics and the design and the system to support newcomers was the first of its kind in the world to receive refugees. Amazing facility. At that time, I think naively, I thought, well, there must be places like this everywhere, because I had no other frame of reference. So please talk about how that
Yeah,
came to be and the
yeah.
inspiration behind it.
So going back to the early 80s, Canada the Canadian government made a decision around, I believe it was 85, to start supporting non-governmental organizations in the creation of refugee reception houses. To better support them. Prior to this time, refugees would arrive from abroad and be placed in hotels. The system and the supports weren't as strong as they are now. There wasn't a realization of the added support that some of these refugee newcomers would need. ISS of BC opened up the first refugee reception center called Welcome House on the corner of Seymour and Drake, 530 Drake Street in Vancouver. And fortunately, through that asset, we were able to take the equity out of that asset, sell that off, and contribute towards our vision of what we have created now, almost 5 years ago, the Welcome Center facility at 2610 Victoria Drive. This is the first social purposed co-location multi-purpose space that is focused on newcomers, whether immigrants or refugees, regardless of legal status, regardless of language ability, religious affiliation, all can seek help through this facility. And what we, in this almost 70,000 square foot facility, what we did at the very beginning of the process was to consult and survey newcomers as to what they needed when they first arrived in this country and how we might, through positive disruption and silo eradication, look at how to provide more horizontal, coordinated, integrated programming within one physical facility. And it was through that process that brought us together with other NGOs, private sector, public institutions to work together to form this integrated service hub. So that's why in the Welcome Center, beyond our offices and programming, including the 140-bed, 18 self-contained apartment units, transitional housing for government-assisted refugees, we also brought in others, Mount Pleasant Family Place, the Vancouver Association for Survivors of Torture, the Vancouver Police Department, a primary healthcare clinic, Van City, the first time Van City has embedded a banking office within a social service agency. So through this positive disruption and silo eradication, we were able to rethink how to provide services in a more coordinated and effective way, in our opinion, to newcomers. This model, this facility has now been studied by 37 different countries. And so far, there is at the moment great interest in both Australia and Sweden to look at how to adapt and replicate this notion as a international promising and innovative practice around newcomer integration.
And I've seen and how we got to know of your work in two fronts. The Vancouver Police Department, Darren Ramdor, brought us over, and then also the Muslim Food Bank. I came to know. I am one of the early founders, and I left the day-to-day early on, and the team developed a relationship with ISS BC, and Muslims that come do get a welcome package from the Muslim Food Bank.
Absolutely. Everybody. We've made it, non-religious affiliated. So the Muslim Food Bank is providing, welcome baskets to all families that arrive and start their new life in this country with us at the Welcome Center facility. Yeah.
The holistic approach. And what I love about your vision, your team's vision, is banking in-house, which is obviously a daunting task for any newcomer to get a bank account. And when I was there's a family, I believe it was a mother with 5 children, and had certain needs that we were trying to work with your team to provide, but also your team would also look for housing, and then not only look for housing, but work on the rental agreements, and all these things that are very
Yeah.
difficult for anyone to figure out, to provide that level of service. That is amazing. And maybe if you're able to talk about maybe either a specific or generalized, depending on privacy issues, but just the extent that families will get this type of support as soon as they arrive to Canada.
Yeah, so I think the best way of understanding the full impact of the facility's offerings is to look at it through the eyes of government-assisted refugee, a family. And there's so many examples over the past 5 years. But what begins to emerge is something like this. A family is selected abroad for resettlement. They have spent sometimes 10, 15, 20 years in a refugee camp.
Wow.
Um, their form of community is built on life in a camp. And suddenly they get this golden opportunity. They've won the lottery. They're one of the very, very, very few, 0.001% of the global refugee crisis is actually given the opportunity to resettle. They arrive at YVR after undertaking their background security clearance, their medical clearance, and so forth. And they arrive at YVR, and within a matter of hours after that, perhaps their first flight, their first time on a plane, they land in our facility by taxi. And they're immediately escorted up to and be provided with orientation in first language. They're assigned a caseworker for the duration of their time in our facility. They're given a cell phone, a refurbished cell phone, thanks to TELUS partnership, and provided with the keys to their suite, orientation to their suite, funds, so that they can immediately purchase their own food. This is pre-COVID I'm talking about now, because currently they have to go into quarantine, self-isolation for 14 days. So they are cooking and cleaning, they're understanding how various, appliances work. They're undertaking first language orientations. They are learning about, basic thing, washer and dryer and doing laundry, using machines and so forth, life skills in some cases. Some folks have resettled in an urban settings, while others have come from refugee camps. So during this time, if they have a medical need, well, there's a clinic, there's a doctor and nurse right down on the main floor. They go through a formal primary health care screening where, based on where they've come from, will determine the level of the testing, assessment, immunizations, all of that is dealt with. If they have a special needs, if there is a need for, a wheelchair, a motorized wheelchair, or other supports, that is all done on site. Through this process of 3-4 weeks, they open their first bank account in Canada. Some will not have any idea how banking system works. They'll get a debit card, an ATM card, and open up their Fan City account. And they will be assigned a worker that will help them find permanent accommodation based on the income support that the Government of Canada provides as part of their first year in Canada. government-assisted refugees are the only newcomer population that is actually invited and supported by the government of Canada. And so at that same time, the youth, through our youth hub on site, youth workers, they will go through their own orientation program. And so it is a whole family approach with unique components for both the family as a whole, for the head of household, for the women of the house, for the youth, and through that process, um, uh, and in addition to that, depending on, they will all receive a mental well-being orientation, trying to start identifying the process of culture shock, the excitement, depression, the peaks and valleys during that initial period in Canada is done by another team member. So that gives you a sense of all the different components. And eventually then they move into their new permanent home somewhere in the Lower Mainland. They are provided with basic household goods, with basic furniture on behalf of the Government of Canada. And from there, they are met by one of our sister agencies, depending on the city, or an ISS staff, another office, where then the continued settlement process evolves, getting the parents, if necessary, in English classes, helping the children to be registered in school. So this is all part and parcel of it. And it's done in partnership. You know, the Muslim Food Bank is an example of a really valued partnership that helps to provide and enhance that welcome to families when they first arrive. And we have, you know, not in different degrees, other faith communities also involved in that. And so this is not just ISS of BC, but this is a whole of community approach. And at points down the road, we will call upon volunteers, settlement mentors, we call them, to work with families, to give them that additional social support to help understand the neighborhoods that they've moved into, practice their English, that sort of thing. So it's a very holistic.
Very holistic. And you brought up one aspect of mental health, and with Syrian refugees, refugees from Iraq, from Afghanistan, parts of Africa that have come, they've seen untold horrors, persecution, torture, and you even have victims of torture. Let's talk about that, because this is something, the physical support, the housing, the food, the money, the furniture, but this is one very key area, and please do talk about that, because it is a very powerful service you're providing.
Yeah, so you know what we have found over the years is that so much of the family, and particularly those that have been persecuted in their country of origin, have had to flee their countries of origin, um, there is such focus on maintaining the safety of the family, and so what happens is that the family that's given the opportunity of resettling in Canada, it's not until about, you know, the end of year 1, year 2, year 3, when the parents can catch their breath for you know, for the first time. They're not looking over their back. They're not expecting a door on the, you know, a knock on the door. They're not, you know, there's not bombs going off, gunfire, and so forth, and the children are established. The children are, you know, integrated and are picking up the language quickly. So when the family begins, when there is a sense of security within the family, then what happens is that's when the trauma, past trauma, begins to emerge, and where support, specialized trauma-informed support, is needed to help some individuals. About 15% is what we have tracked. Will need a formal mental health clinical intervention. in order to be able to address and respond to what they have personally experienced or witnessed. So yes, it's a reality of the situation. But at the same time, as I said, what has always inspired me is the resilience. And ultimately, it is about the triumph of the human spirit against all these atrocities, that they have found a home here in Canada, and they are able to, contribute, to give back. Um, and that is ultimately what they want. They want the support. They want to be able to contribute, and they want the stability for their children, access to education, and so forth. That many of us in this country take for granted.
Absolutely. And your department of VAST, which is focused on people of victims of torture,
Yeah,
and that's separate from a psychological
yeah.
uh, ailment, people that have been tortured by other people. Please talk about how that came to be and the impact of that work.
So that VAST, the Vancouver Association for the Survivors of Torture, is a separate legal entity that is a tenant within our Vancouver and Surrey offices. And yeah, VAST emerged, out of a necessity that was beginning to be seen in quite heightened ways by a variety of medical personnel, going back around the Central America, the Chileans, fleeing human rights at that time. And there was a growing body around the world that was looking at survivors of torture and the need for distinct trauma-informed practice, different from mental health programming of Canadian residents, middle class or otherwise. But through the refugee lens, it evolved. And so there are a small number of these specialized organizations in Canada and around the world that are focused on helping those survivors of torture work through the trauma, the unique trauma that they have experienced through their migration, in order to fully function, in Canadian society. Not most um, formal mental health systems, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc., do not have the cultural competency necessary to address issues of trauma, because it is a form of violence that is not practiced in this country. So it really calls upon specialized interventions of a variety of sources to work with such individuals.
And again, very comprehensive work. We met another a person that Shaza, who's
Yeah.
a WUSC scholarship recipient, and she was a previous guest on telling her story of what happened to her and her family in Syria. Just horrific to be able to have been through that as a young person. And let's talk about WUSC, like somebody who has come from that, witnessed what she's witnessed, and now getting to a higher level of education to achieve a different standing in life. Please talk
Yeah.
about this.
I think, let's go back, essentially, in my opinion, the one of the critical ways in which to alleviate issues of poverty and human rights is through education. And as I alluded to, through my time as a student at UBC, this referendum that passed only by 22 votes, um, created this permanent scholarship program, which has evolved as the World University of Services of Canada, a student refugee sponsorship program, which is now in over 60 different post-secondary institutions in Canada, but is also seen as an innovative alternative resettlement pathway by other nation states, resettlement nation states. So for students to come, for refugee students who have had to force to flee their country, but also the break in their education, realizing the importance and the value of education. The WUSCA Student Refugee Program provides an incredible opportunity for students that would never be given the opportunity to come to Canada as an international student, paying the enormous fees that we charge international students to be able to continue their education. And so through this program, not only does it provide student refugees an opportunity to continue their education as permanent residents processed through the private sponsorship program, but also it helps to engage students and faculty on the campus to better understand the plight of refugees in a different lens. And so there's multiple beneficial dynamics associated with this program. What we have found over time is that many students will go back, not necessarily to their country of origin, but back overseas with the education that they have acquired in Canada as part of that process of giving back through the opportunity that they were provided. And so it is a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous program. Um, and my understanding most recently, the UBC, I believe, is now taking upwards of 7 or 9 students a year based on the funding that is contributed by students through their fees. So, these types of programs, I think, they're not talked about enough, but they reaffirm my faith in humanity that, when we come together as humans, when we put aside the divisions or how divisions occur, the tribalism and religion and so forth, ethnicity, to look at us all as equal as humans, to have equal access and opportunities. This is where I think we can make significant strides as part of the humanity.
Absolutely, and again, I have to commend you and your team for this amazing work that needs to be told more often, because we're inundated by negative news, but the work that you're doing to be part of this solution, which a lot of people like talking about problems, but the solutions, I think that to hear these voices, and now in the macro sense is also the aftercare. So after, and also technology and your I think it's immigration.info or immigrant.info, your
Oh,
technology, your text
right,
messaging technology. Let's talk
right.
about other unique innovations and ideas to also support and communicate with refugees and immigrant populations.
Yeah, I think, one thing that COVID has taught us, on the one hand, is the great digital divide that exists, the access and familiarity to technology is unequal. It is unequal within Canadian society, and that plays out as well with newcomers. And access to to computers, familiarity with computers. But at the same time, too, there are some tools that have created opportunities to relook at how we offer support, utilize technology, the cell phone being one. Most newcomers, regardless of how they come to this country, will have a cell phone. Not every member of the family will have a cell phone, but at least one member will have the cell phone. And this came to us a couple of years ago. And given the increased numbers of particularly refugee claimants that were entering BC, we were looking at different ways of how to support them because we had finite staffing resources as part of our teams. And so one thing led to another, and in a partnership with the Vancouver Community Network, we established Newcomer.info. And this is a two-way texting platform that allows us to take a message, translate it into whatever language we wish, and to blast it out to thousands of people at the same time, and thus being able to communicate faster to large groups of people, policy changes, opportunities, job fairs, workshops coming up. And so this is, yeah, part and parcel of reflecting on the advancements of technology and how we can better use them. Same with messaging apps. Now, we have recently moved from WhatsApp to Telegram is our official messaging app that we're using. We have developed digital literacy curriculum using Telegram on iPhones and Android devices. And our vision is to continue to bring newcomers in through Telegram as another way of providing support, updates, keeping in contact with folks, to thousands of individuals that we simply could not do given the limitations of staffing resources. So it's a journey, and it is evolving as we understand. But ultimately, it comes back down to client-centered services, client-centered approaches, understanding, asking questions, being curious, and not assuming anything, but but um, but gleaning insights into different client needs to be able to respond to them in different ways. Goes back to that what I was saying earlier. One size doesn't fit all, but there are technology tools that we're seeing that allow us the ability to increase the impact of our work, increase the accessibility of our knowledge, our work, our services, programs, and that's the journey that we're on.
And I like the fact that text messages on your website was 100% open rate rather than an email, which how many emails do we open that come into our inbox? And so that is a direct way to get to the messaging out. And one thing I wanted to talk about was the entrepreneurship of refugees. And you talked about resilience. And one of the statistics I read that refugees on average, a huge percentage of them start their own businesses. And in your family's case, coming 1875 from East Germany, another thing I read, refugees from Germany and Russia in after World War II, between 50 and 70% of new patents were created by those refugees. So that type of intellect and that type of mind share that's brought to the table, the talents, the arts, the culture. Let's talk about the kind of resilience in terms of entrepreneurship of refugees that you've seen wanting to start businesses and really choose that route rather than a job.
Yeah, well, I think that, what you said it makes so much, it's so true, and this goes back to the notion of that resilience and assets as a public, as media. When you hear the word refugee, we automatically assume a deficit. It's associated with a deficit, someone in need, someone that doesn't have skills and abilities. It doesn't recognize that lived experience and skills and assets. It doesn't assume it through an asset-based approach. And as you pointed out, given the economies in the country of origin, entrepreneurial spirit is part of the DNA of many refugees. But it is the ability to transfer that knowledge and assets within the Canadian context is what we're trying to support through programs that we run and others run. Um, we have been operating a program called Spark and Ignite, a program that originated in Australia. We were the first agency in Canada to replicate this Australian model into the Canadian context to really support where refugees and immigrants were at and their passion to start a business and to help them through that process based on their assets and skills and passion. Not to force them to learn accounting and business plans, but to help guide them through other mentors to help them fulfill their dream of establishing a business and linking them to banking, seed funding, and so forth. And so there is a tremendous amount of entrepreneurship, and we have seen many different businesses created by refugee newcomers continue. And again, it goes back to that notion when given some initial support to help stabilize them. It's a huge transition, but with a little bit of support, um, they can, able to run with the passion and the skills that they have to make a contribution to Canada and to their society and to their neighborhood.
One of the stories that was inspiring, the founder of WhatsApp was
Yeah,
a refugee or immigrant from Russia, and they were on food stamps in the early 90s, struggled quite a bit, and then they were bought out for $19 billion, and he chose to go to where he used to get food stamps as a way that he had support. And this type of support, everyone needs support,
yeah,
and that
absolutely.
I
I
believe.
think, yeah, unbelievable. I think it also goes back to something that we've talked about previously. This global refugee crisis is growing. It is, we have a situation around the world now where we have protracted refugee situations, 10, 20, 30 plus years. And as I stated earlier, the small, minute percentage of refugees that will be given the opportunity of resettlement really acquires us to relook at how the UN Refugee Agency defines its durable solutions. In my mind, it's not about getting rid of the three current durable solutions, whether that is local integration, repatriation to your country of origin, or resettlement. It's building upon that with the introduction of a fourth durable solution, and that is human development. To me, I think this is where technology through a humanitarian lens could have the greatest impact. And what I mean by that is that, a case in point, northern Kenya, two significant refugee camps, Dadaab and Kakuma, where close to 500,000 people have lived for close to 30 years. They're not going anywhere. They're not going back to Somalia. There's ongoing now tension in Ethiopia and elsewhere. Why can't technology through a humanitarian lens be utilized to provide opportunities for online post-secondary learning? Why can't we be looking at now those that are graduating from from high school in these camps to begin to bring them the opportunity of furthering their education through a variety of training programming. We've seen how Canadian universities, post-secondaries can pivot to online learning. This really shrinks our world even more. So why can't a refugee in a camp in northern Kenya or in Jordan or in Myanmar, why, or Cameroon, why couldn't they access UBC education as part of our, support for development objectives through a defined fourth durable solution that, as human development, with the understanding is that as we increase education and knowledge of refugees in protracted camp situation, it gives them more opportunity perhaps for local integration, for repatriation as educated individuals being able to contribute to the rebuilding of the country in which they're at, their home country, or perhaps as Canada is doing now through an economic stream, we're looking at refugees with specific knowledge, skills, educational qualifications, credentials, to be able to be processed to Canada, not under humanitarian, but under economic stream. So it really, I think, it really, is a collective effort to look at the vast amounts of research and evaluation, the vast investments in technology to say, the digital divide, unequal access. Are there ways through private sector contributions to enhance and offer post-secondary education to those that will never have the opportunity of resettlement?
And you brought up a very powerful point, because the refugee crisis at the moment is 80 million people worldwide internally displaced and that are categorized as refugees, with the UN predicting by 2030 that'll go up to 300 million refugees. So it's almost like cities of refugees,
Exactly.
millions of refugees, as you said, in Jordan, in Turkey, and in places in Africa, in Myanmar. So in essence, educational institutions that could be part and parcel of the refugee camps, and instead of just providing food and humanitarian medical aid, but that educational component that could lessen that time in that refugee camp for families whose students or parents could educate themselves and then become a valuable commodity for developed countries to bring them in. And
Absolutely. Or return home, as part of the new education, population, right, to contribute to the rebuilding of the country on which they originated from. To me, I think it all goes back to education. It's such a fundamental necessity in order to alleviate, some of the ills that inflict, our planet, whether that's human rights and girls' education, and there's just, I think, so much can be maybe not eliminated, but reduced through increased opportunities and exposure to higher levels of education.
Absolutely. And even the new economy with coding, software languages,
Exactly.
and such valuable skills that anyone would want to hire folks with Java, C++, Python, these type of computer languages that even with minimal English, these things can be done. And we do owe you our presentation on the technologies that we're working on, and we're polishing it up for you.
Yeah.
So we'll have that over to you soon, which touches these areas, healthcare and education. and we'll send that to you. And then in closing, there's a group called the Refugee Investment Network, John Kluge, and their focus was to basically invest in refugees that do come to North America, as that the entrepreneurship, the drive, the kind of return on investment on newcomers is significant enough for them to create such a big fund behind it. And again, resilience, the entrepreneurial zeal of refugees. And this is what our country, Canada, the United States, been founded on, this entrepreneurial drive that newcomers have. So on that positive note for naysayers, and one thing we didn't talk about are online disinformation or online hate against newcomers and people of different faiths and what have you that are coming. So for those that have this negative sentiment, the statistics and the facts are refugees are a net gain. And please.
Absolutely, no question. When you look at Canadian history and you look at the contribution of refugees going back, to Eastern Europeans, my ancestry, to, the Hungarian, 56, each movement, the Vietnamese boat people, Iraqi Kurds and the Somalis, and in most recent times the Kosovars, the Syrians. There has been milestones, refugee crisis milestones, and Canada has responded. But if you look back at all the research, yes, there is a period of time where refugees need some support. But they always tend to meet and then surpass Canadian wage earners, driven, as I said, by that entrepreneurial, spirit, but also the resilience and the realization of what they have faced and the opportunity that this country has provided them. They are, absolutely committed to giving back.
Absolutely.
And it's about those of us to ensure that we help open the doors that allow them to fully contribute and participate in their new home, Canada.
Absolutely. And I will say, Chris, just fantastic work. I know it's an ongoing effort, but even the foundations that have been established by yourself, your team, is very commendable. There's a lot of love and respect from us for the work that you guys are doing, and however we can support and help within our respective networks, we're here to do. And so ISS BC, also WUSC for the scholarships, and then the newcomer.info for folks that want to connect on that network. Is there any other ways that you would like people to connect with ISS BC, or anything that you would like to leave the listeners and the viewers?
I think that, again, we live in a busy time. We have multiple obligations and so forth. But if some of your listeners, have some time, that's one of the precious gifts, is the gift of time. And we have over 1,000 volunteers, but we're always looking for other volunteers in various capacities. We've got programming right now trying to teach technology to seniors, and we need tech mentors, that can support seniors to understand some of the nuances. Or it's matching up with a local family, a refugee family, to help provide a social support network, right? We're about to launch in the coming months a national bike host mentorship program, where we're going to be bringing recent immigrants and refugees together with longer term resident mentors to help teach them biking, cycling in the city, safety, again, as a way to learn more about the neighborhood and city in which they live in, but also as another way to connect around the importance of building that welcoming and inclusive community. So, yeah, volunteering is another a way to consider giving back.
Absolutely, and we'll definitely put that call out in our promotional poster, and maybe in an email, if you can send an email where folks can reach out directly.
Sure.
Just one last item: there's a group that we were working with before the lockdown that was doing coding for kids,
Yeah.
which is funded by Amazon,
Yeah.
and we'd be happy to make that introduction, because if that's something that we could help, that would be a great way for us to support the work as well.
Yeah, I'd love to connect you to my colleague, because we've got a couple of tech programs going on right now for women. And so there might be some synergy there, and I'd love to connect. I'll do an e-introduction. If you send me some info about this coding stuff, I'll do an e-introduction.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Chris. It was
So
a great.
keep up your good work. Ultimately, this is about silo
busting.
And positive disruption.
Yeah, and we can, Yusuf, this is where we can pause our interview, and now we can have our other discussion.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good.
We were going to send you the technology, but we wanted to polish it up and update it.